1 year ago, the sixth largest earthquake ever recorded tore 500 kilometers of fault off the coast of Kamchatka. And then, mid-arc, it stopped. The section it left unbroken has been sitting locked and loaded ever since. This week, both ends of that section started shaking within 36 hours of each other, while the rest of the planet went seismically silent. By the end of this video, you'll know what those earthquakes are actually telling us, what the last full rupture here did to an entire town, and exactly what to watch for next. The Kamchatka arc produced 10 cataloged earthquakes between Monday morning and Tuesday afternoon, and every one of them landed on the same 2,100-kilometer stretch of plate boundary in the Northwest Pacific. The magnitudes ran from 4.5 to 4.9. 4 of them hit magnitude 4.9, one east of the Kuril Islands at a depth of just under 10 kilometers, one about 200 kilometers southeast of the Russian town of Severokurilsk, one 85 kilometers south of that same town at a depth of nearly 58 kilometers, and one in the Kurils at 76 kilometers down. 2 magnitude 4.7s followed, one south of Shikotan Island and one in the southern Kurils. 3 more events at 4.5 and 4.6 filled in the picture, including 2 on the Japan Trench off the Tohoku coast, the southern continuation of the very same plate boundary. None of these earthquakes on its own is news. A magnitude 4.9 on a remote oceanic arc breaks nothing and hurts no one. The Kurils produce moderate earthquakes routinely because this is one of the most seismically productive boundaries on the planet. The boundary itself is worth 30 seconds of respect before we go further, because its statistics are extreme even by Pacific standards. The Kamchatka Trench marks the line where the Pacific Plate dives beneath the Okhotsk microplate, and the trench floor drops to more than 10,000 meters below sea level, one of the deepest places on the planet. The convergence rate runs 75 to 80 millimeters per year, among the fastest of any major subduction zone anywhere. That same engine feeds one of the densest concentrations of active volcanoes on Earth along the arc above it. And in the instrumental era, this single boundary has produced at least 3 earthquakes of magnitude 8.5 or greater: 1952, 1963, and 2025, with a magnitude 8.3 in 2006 close behind. Almost no other subduction zone on the planet can match that record. What made seismologists sit up this week was not any single event. It was all of them together, where they landed, when they landed, and what the rest of the planet was doing at the same time. Because when you plot these 10 earthquakes on a map, they do something that random seismicity is not supposed to do. They organize. The events split cleanly into 2 groups. The northern group clusters between roughly 49 and 51 degrees north, around the southern coast of Kamchatka and the town of Severokurilsk at the top of the Kuril chain. The southern group sits near 43 degrees north around Shikotan Island at the bottom of the chain and extends under the Japan Trench off the Tohoku coast. Between those 2 groups lies the central section of the Kuril arc, and in this 36-hour window, that central section produced almost nothing. 2 dense patches of seismic activity separated by hundreds of kilometers of near silence. If earthquakes were scattering randomly along the arc, you would not expect them to sort themselves into 2 tight groups with an empty middle. Random processes are clumpy, but this is not ordinary clumpiness, because the location of that quiet middle is not just any stretch of fault. It is the one section of this entire boundary that seismologists have been watching more closely than any other. To understand why, you have to go back 1 year, almost to the day. And that is where this stops being a story about magnitude 4 earthquakes. There is one more piece of context that sharpens everything, and it comes from the global picture. Over the past week, worldwide earthquake activity dropped noticeably. The 7-day global count of earthquakes at magnitude 4.5 or greater fell from 150 to 126, a decline of 16%. The largest earthquake anywhere on Earth during this window was a magnitude 5.2 in central Peru, an event about 130 kilometers down inside a subducting slab, completely unrelated to the Northwest Pacific. Nothing at magnitude 6 has happened anywhere in days. One environmental factor can be ruled out immediately, Because the claim always surfaces when clusters like this appear, the sun had nothing to do with it. This burst coincided with one of the quietest space weather stretches of the year. Geomagnetic activity bottomed out near the floor of the scale. The solar wind ran slow and steady, and the X-ray background sat at baseline. Whatever organized these earthquakes, it was working from below, not above. So, this burst is not part of a global uptick. The planet as a whole went seismically slack this week. Against that quiet backdrop, a single arc lighting up with 7+ events at magnitude 4.5 or higher in a day and a half stands out the way a lit window stands out on a dark street. Whatever is happening on the Kuril-Kamchatka boundary is local. The energy is being worked on there and effectively nowhere else. That is the setup. Now here's the reason the geography of those two clusters matters more than anything else in this story. On July 29, 2025, 1 year and 5 days before this burst, the Kamchatka end of this same plate boundary ruptured in a moment magnitude 8.8 megathrust earthquake. It tied for the 6th largest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded anywhere in the entire history of seismology. The numbers from that event are difficult to absorb. The rupture tore along the plate interface for somewhere between 390 and 600 kilometers, depending on which model you use, across a fault surface up to 200 kilometers wide. In localized patches, the two sides of the fault slipped past each other by 30 to 40 meters. The rupture lasted somewhere between 190 and 270 seconds. The fault kept tearing for 3 to 4.5 minutes straight. Back projection studies published in the seismic record, corroborated by hydroacoustic recordings, show the rupture propagated predominantly southwestward from the epicenter, extending roughly 500 kilometers down the arc toward the Kurils. The tsunami that followed was severe along at least 550 kilometers of the southeastern Kamchatka coast and the northern Kurils. Survey teams measured run-ups of 2 to 3 meters at minimum and more typically 5 to 10 meters. Along a 100-kilometer stretch of Kamchatka, the water reached 10 to 16 meters. In the northern Kuril Islands, it reached 19 meters, a 6-story building of ocean. Smaller waves crossed the entire Pacific, reaching Japan, Hawaii, and the Americas, and alerts went out basin-wide. Casualties, remarkably, were minimal, a result of sparse population on the ruptured coastline, effective evacuation, and favorable rupture geometry. The aftershock sequence behaved the way great earthquake sequences do. The United States Geological Survey issued a formal aftershock forecast, and the sequence delivered, including a magnitude 6.8 in the Kuril Islands region in early August of 2025, within days of the main shock. Through the years since, the sequence has decayed steadily the way these sequences are supposed to. By this summer, the arc had settled into what looked like a normal post-megaquake rhythm, gradually fewer events, gradually smaller, the system slowly digesting the largest stress change it had experienced in 70 years. Here is the detail that matters for this week. The rupture propagated southwest down the arc, and then it stopped. It did not break the full boundary. The section of the interface south of where it quit, the central and southern Kurils, has not ruptured. All the strain the section has been accumulating remains locked in place. Seismologists have a name for a stretch of fault like that. They call it a gap. A seismic gap is not an empty space. It is a loaded one. The Pacific Plate dives beneath this arc at 75 to 80 millimeters per year, one of the fastest sustained convergence rates of any subduction zone on Earth. Where the interface is fully locked, that motion stores about 1 meter of unreleased slip every 12 to 13 years. The section south of the 2025 rupture has been storing strain this way for decades at minimum, and it did not let go last year. There is a second effect stacked on top of that steady loading, and it is the textbook consequence of every great earthquake. When a magnitude 8.8 releases centuries of accumulated strain along 500 kilometers of fault, the surrounding system does not relax back to normal. It reorganizes. The stress that the ruptured section shed does not vanish. A portion of it transfers along the boundary, concentrating at the margins of the rupture beyond both ends. Seismologists call the mechanism Coulomb stress transfer, and its standard signature is elevated earthquake activity at the rupture edges for years afterward. One more point about timing belongs here, because it is the kind of detail that is either meaningless or meaningful, and nothing in between. This burst arrived almost exactly 1 year after the megaquake, July 29th to August 3rd, 370 days. Nobody serious claims earthquakes keep anniversaries. A calendar coincidence is coincidence until proven otherwise. But the 1-year mark is roughly the timescale on which post-seismic processes, afterslip on the fault, slow relaxation in the mantle beneath it, continue redistributing stress along a boundary after a great rupture. A year out is not late for the neighborhood of a magnitude 8.8 to still be reorganizing. In that sense, the timing does not prove anything, but it fits. Now, look at this week's map again with all of that in mind. The northern cluster sits at and just beyond the southern end of the 2025 rupture zone, exactly where transferred stress should be concentrating. The southern cluster sits at the far end of the unruptured section, where the Kuril arc hands off to the Japan Trench. The two ends of the loaded gap produced earthquakes in the same 36-hour window, while the gap itself stayed silent, and while the rest of the planet stayed quiet too. The fault system is sketching an outline, and the shape it is sketching is the one section of itself that has not yet failed. And the historical record of this exact arc says that outline deserves to be taken seriously. Subduction zones sometimes fail like a zipper. One segment ruptures in a great earthquake, and then months to years later, the adjacent segment follows. The most famous case is Sumatra. In December 2004, the magnitude 9.1 Sumatra Andaman earthquake ruptured and produced the Indian Ocean tsunami. 3 months later, in March 2005, the very next segment to the south failed in the magnitude 8.6 Nias earthquake. Same boundary, adjacent segment, 90 days apart. You do not have to leave the Kuril arc to find the same behavior. In November 2006, the central Kurils, the very section that sits between this week's two clusters, produced a magnitude 8.3 thrust earthquake on the plate interface. 59 days later, in January 2007, a magnitude 8.1 struck in nearly the same location on a structure just seaward of the trench that had been loaded by the first event. One great earthquake manufactured a second great earthquake in under 2 months on this same arc, in the middle section of this same chain. The 2006 and 2007 pair is worth a closer look because the mechanism is instructive. The first event was an interplate thrust, the classic megathrust type, the two plates lurching past each other on their contact surface. The second was different, an outer rise normal faulting event, a rupture in the Pacific plate itself, seaward of the trench where the plate bends before diving down. The first earthquake changed the stress on that bending region enough to break it. That is the point. A great rupture does not just relieve stress, it moves stress. And the places it moves stress to can fail on their own schedule. 59 days was the schedule that time. That precedent is why the question being asked this week is not paranoid. It is the same question the arc itself has already answered once in the affirmative. When a 500-kilometer rupture stops partway down a boundary, the section beyond the stopping point becomes the natural candidate for the next large event. Whether the weight is measured in days, years, or decades is the part nobody can answer. But this arc has shown it can be measured in weeks, and what the last full-scale rupture of the gap's own neighborhood did 74 years ago is the reason the stakes here are not abstract. The reference city that appears in this week's earthquake catalog is Severokurilsk on Paramushir Island at the northern end of the chain. The listings literally measure the new earthquakes by their distance from it. 85 kilometers south of Severokurilsk, 204 kilometers southeast of Severokurilsk. There is a grim irony in that, because Severokurilsk is the site of the deadliest tsunami in Russian history, produced by the same stretch of plate boundary. On November 5th, 1952, at 4:58 in the morning, local time, the southern Kamchatka and northern Kuril section of this interface ruptured in an earthquake estimated between magnitude 8.8 and 9.0, still the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Russia, a title the 2025 event only tied. The shaking itself killed relatively few people. Residents of Severokurilsk did what coastal people are taught to do. They fled to the hills, and they survived the first tsunami wave. Then many of them came back down. They returned to their homes to search for belongings, to look for family. And the second wave, the largest of three, roughly 15 to 18 meters, caught them in the streets and erased the town. The details of that morning have been reconstructed from survivor accounts collected decades later. The first wave arrived roughly 45 minutes after the shaking, and it was survivable. Most of the town's population was already on high ground. The interval after, it was the trap. Tsunamis arrive as a series, often separated by tens of minutes, and the later waves are frequently larger than the first. The people walking back down into Severokurilsk had no way to know that, because nothing in their experience or their government's public guidance had told them. The second wave came in at roughly 15 to 18 meters and moved through the town at the speed of a fast car. A third wave followed. By sunrise, the town functionally did not exist. The official Soviet death toll was 2,336. Modern estimates run far higher, commonly to 8,000, and by some estimates as many as 14,000. The reason for that uncertainty is itself part of the story. The Soviet government classified the entire disaster. There were no newspaper reports, no published casualty lists, no public record of any kind for decades. A town was destroyed and thousands of people died. And officially, it simply had not happened. The true toll may never be known. Severokurilsk was rebuilt partly on higher ground. 74 years later, the instruments recording this week's burst are measuring earthquake positions by their distance from that rebuilt town. That is what the full-scale version of this stretch of boundary failing actually looks like. It is not a hypothetical. It happened within living memory. And the gap between this week's two clusters is next door to where it happened. The earthquakes in this week's burst were not all the same kind of event. And the differences carry information. The depth spanned from just under 10 kilometers to 76 kilometers. The shallowest events sit at the level of the plate interface itself, the locked contact surface where megathrust earthquakes are born. The events at 50 to 76 kilometers are something else. Intraslab earthquakes, breaking inside the descending Pacific plate as it bends and sinks, redistributing stress within the slab rather than on the boundary between plates. Both populations activated in the same window, and that ambiguity cuts both ways. If the follow-up analysis resolves the shallow events as thrust-type ruptures on the interface, it strengthens the reading that the locked, loaded section is being stressed toward the top of its cycle. If most of the burst turns out to be adjustment inside the sinking slab, it says more about the plate bending at depth than about the megathrust zone itself. A useful way to picture the difference is to think of the subduction zone as a conveyor and a clutch. The interface, the contact between the plates, is the clutch, and when it is locked, the whole system stores energy. The slab below is the conveyor itself, and it flexes and cracks internally as it descends, whether the clutch is locked or not. Intraslab earthquakes are the conveyor creaking. Interface earthquakes are the clutch slipping. Only the clutch can produce a magnitude 9 and a Pacific crossing tsunami, which is why the question of which population dominated this week's burst is not academic. As of Tuesday, the reviewed focal mechanisms for these events had not yet been published. They typically appear within days. They are the single most important near-term piece of evidence in the story. That is a rare thing in earthquake science, a specific checkable observation arriving on a known schedule that will materially shift the interpretation one way or the other. The honest statistics need to be stated plainly because they are the guardrail on everything else in this video. Roughly 19 out of 20 moderate earthquake clusters are followed by nothing larger. The base rate probability that any given event turns out to be a foreshock to something bigger within the following days runs around 5 to 6%. Foreshocks are only ever identified in retrospect. No instrument on Earth can tag one in advance. The most likely outcome of this week's burst by far is that it fades back into the ark's ordinary background chatter. But the same honesty requires the other half of the sentence. That identical statement would have been true of the moderate events that preceded nearly every great earthquake in history, right up until the main shock arrived. The statistics bound the odds. They do not dismiss the geography. And it is the geography, the bracketing of a known loaded gap 1 year after the rupture that created it. that keeps this burst from being ordinary noise? One claim circulating this week deserves a quick answer. The idea that agencies are hiding earthquakes because seismograph stations visibly record more small events than the public catalogs list. The explanation is thresholds, not concealment. Remote oceanic arcs like the Curls have a practical reporting floor near magnitude 4 to 4.5, and automated detections below review thresholds are not published until analysts confirm them. Different agencies apply different cutoffs, which is why one feed shows 3 events where another shows 1, and this arc supplies the definitive counterexample from both directions. In 1952, the government really did conceal a disaster, sealed records, erased casualty lists, a closed state with no outside data. In 2025, the same arc was covered by open global catalogs, public mechanism solutions, and independent tsunami buoys, and Pacific-wide alerts went out within minutes of the main shock. The infrastructure that hid 1952 no longer exists. The infrastructure that saved lives last year is publicly auditable by anyone. The watch list for the coming days and weeks is specific. The first item is the gap itself. The signal that would materially change this picture is an earthquake of magnitude 5.5 or larger, with a thrust-type interface mechanism located between the 2 clusters in the central Curals. That would mean the quiet section is no longer quiet and that stress is being worked on inside the gap, rather than only at its ends. As of Tuesday, the center remains silent. There's a hard number attached to that first criterion, and it comes from the loading math. At 75 to 80 millimeters of convergence per year, a locked section that last fully ruptured generations ago is carrying multiple meters of stored slip deficit. That energy does not leak away. It waits, and it grows by about a meter every 12 to 13 years until something spends it. The second item is the mechanism solutions for this week's events, expected within days. Interface thrust mechanisms strengthen the loaded segment reading. Mostly intraslab mechanisms would ease it. The third is simple persistence, whether the 2 clusters keep producing, migrate toward each other, or fade out. Fading is the most likely outcome, and would close this chapter quietly. It is worth saying what preparedness already looks like here, because the contrast between 1952 and 2025 is the most hopeful fact in this story. The same stretch of boundary that once killed thousands in enforced silence produced a top 6 earthquake last year, with minimal loss of life, because warnings move faster than water. If the gap fails this year, this decade, or 50 years from now, the tsunami will be measured in meters and the response time in minutes. And the difference between those 2 eras is the open monitoring network watching this arc right now. Our video from June 19th covered the Kamchatka doublet that shook the same coastline. And our video from July 21st covered the volcano this same subduction engine keeps fed on the peninsula above it. The arc has been sending signals all summer. This week, for the first time, the signals drew a shape. 2 clusters of earthquakes standing at either end of the last unbroken section of a boundary that has already shown the world twice what it does when it breaks. The mechanisms publish within days. The gap either stays quiet or it does not. We are watching either way, and you will hear about it here.